At a certain level, progress stops being blocked by skill or effort, and it's blocked by internal constraints instead that were formed earlier and never revised. The mind reaches the edge of its previous development, and beyond that edge, pressure activates resistance. Growth begins to trigger behaviors that slow or sabotage your progress, even though they feel rational from the inside. You hesitate where you once moved. You overanalyze decisions that you would have made cleanly before. You double down on methods that used to work while quietly dismissing alternatives that require a different internal posture.
Welcome to Beyond Success, the podcast for high achievers seeking deeper meaning, fulfillment, and purpose. Now, here's your host, world-renowned leadership coach and therapist, David Tian, PhD.
There's a point in many people's careers and businesses where output keeps increasing while judgment quietly degrades. Not in some dramatic way, not as like a collapse or a burnout or some obvious failure. From the outside, things might still look solid. Competence still shows up, results still arrive, your authority remains intact, people still listen to you, decisions still get made, the machine keeps moving. And that's exactly why this phase is actually so dangerous, because internally, the experience is very different. The signals feel noisier, decisions feel heavier, wins feel flatter than they used to, even when they're objectively larger. The sense of traction is replaced by a kind of low-grade friction that's hard to name and even harder to justify. Nothing's wrong enough to stop, nothing's broken enough to fix, so most people don't do anything about it. They assume this is just the cost of scale, or responsibility, or maturity, or success itself. But there's a deeper problem hiding here. You can still look like you're winning while your internal instrumentation is already lying to you. That's the part no one warns you about, because we're taught to watch for failure. We're taught to watch for stress. We're taught to watch for exhaustion. We're not taught to watch for degraded clarity. And degraded clarity doesn't just announce itself. It doesn't trigger alarms. It doesn't show up in dashboards or quarterly reviews. It shows up in subtler ways. In decisions that technically work but still feel slightly off, in confidence that feels thinner, in control that needs to be tighter than it used to be. If you're very honest with yourself, you may already sense this, the quiet suspicion that something important is no longer clean, not bad enough to justify changing course yet, not alarming enough to do anything drastic, just enough to notice and then ignore. And that's where this curve starts flattening and then dropping. Because the real risk at this stage isn't losing performance yet. It's trusting judgment that no longer deserves the same confidence. Look, we're all taught a very simple curve. Put in the effort, get the results. Build confidence, make better decisions. And early on, this model works. It works well enough that it starts to feel like some kind of law of nature. Work harder, think sharper, rise faster. The feedback seems clean. When a decision is wrong, reality pushes back quickly. When a decision is right, the reward is obvious. Confidence grows because it's earned, and judgment improves because it's constantly being tested. So the mind draws a quiet conclusion. If results are going up, clarity must be going up too. But that conclusion stops being true long before anyone really notices, because there's another part of the curve that very few people talk about. Output can keep rising while clarity peaks and then begins to decline. Not sharply at first and not catastrophically yet, just enough to matter. The work still gets done, the numbers still move, the calendar still stays full. And from the outside, nothing looks broken. But from the inside, the decisions take more energy than they used to. The sense of ease disappears. You start compensating with more preparation, more control, more force. And the reason this is so often missed is actually simple. There's no immediate penalty. There's no public feedback. No one pulls you aside and says your judgment isn't as clear as it used to be. There's no spreadsheet column for signal quality, no metric for internal noise. The system only measures output, and output is still coming. So the curve flattens invisibly. Let me ask this plainly, because it's the question most people never consider. If performance is still increasing, how would you even know that your judgment is actually deteriorating? Well, you wouldn't, not directly. What you'd notice instead are secondary effects. Decisions that work but create more downstream friction. Wins that require more effort to sustain. A growing reliance on familiar strategies, not because they're better, but because they feel safer. But none of that looks like failure. And that's where the misunderstanding creeps in. Most people assume decline only shows up as failure, as missed targets, as lost status, as collapse. But that assumption is wrong. At this stage, decline shows up as distortion, as reduced sensitivity to signal, as confidence that's still loud enough to act, but no longer precise enough to trust. The tragedy is that the very thing that once improved judgment now hides its erosion. Success keeps rewarding you just enough to keep you from questioning the accuracy of your decisions. So the part of the curve no one mentions becomes the most dangerous part of all. Now, think back to the early phase, before things became complicated, before scale, before layers of abstraction, before reputation started buffering you from the consequences of your own decisions. In that early stage, feedback felt clean. You make a move and reality responds quickly. You try something out and within days or weeks, you know whether it worked. Effort has a visible relationship to outcome. If you prepare well, things tend to go better. If you cut corners, the cost shows up almost immediately. That environment does something important to your judgment. Mistakes are obvious. They sting just enough to be memorable, but not enough to be fatal. Corrections are quick. You adjust, you try again, and you see the result. The nervous system learns that the world is legible. Cause and effect make sense. Action and consequence stay close to each other. There's very little room for self-deception here. You can't hide behind status that you don't have yet. You can't outsource responsibility yet. You can't rationalize poor decisions for very long because reality pushes back before that story has time to harden. So confidence grows in a healthy way. Not because you feel invincible, but because your judgment keeps getting calibrated by reality. You learn what you're good at. You learn where you're sloppy. You learn how much effort's required to move the needle. And because the signals are clean, learning can happen fast. This is why early success often feels strangely calm in retrospect. There is urgency, of course, pressure, of course, but there's also clarity. You know what matters today. You know what a good decision looks like. You know whether you earned the result or got lucky, because the distance between your action and the outcome is still short enough to tell the difference cleanly. In the beginning, reality is an honest teacher. It doesn't flatter you, it doesn't protect your ego, it doesn't wait politely while you construct a better explanation. It simply responds. And because of that, you can form trust with the reality and yourself. Not blind confidence, but a grounded trust in your own ability to read the situation and adjust accordingly. You trust your judgment because it keeps getting tested and corrected in real time. This is the part of the curve that people later romanticize, the garage phase, the early climb, the years where everything felt simpler even if it was actually harder. What they're really remembering isn't the lack of responsibility or the smaller stakes. They're remembering clear signal. They're remembering a time when effort meant something specific. Feedback arrived quickly, and the world made sense often enough that you can improve your decisions in real time. And that contrast and environment really matters, because once feedback slows down, once buffers appear, once consequences become delayed or diluted, judgment stops being shaped in the same way. And then something subtly changes. Not because anything failed, not because pressure became unbearable, and not because you lost your edge. It changes because the mind did what it learned to do earlier and never learned how to operate at the next phase. Early on, progress feels vivid, wins register, and losses sting. Each step forward carries emotional weight. And over time, that contrast fades. The first layer of this is biological, and it's remarkably ordinary. Early wins stop registering as meaningful. What once felt like progress now feels expected. Baseline expectations rise quietly without discussion or consent. The nervous system recalibrates to the new normal and treats it as standard operating conditions. This isn't fragility, it isn't burnout, and it isn't a lack of gratitude. It's the brain doing exactly what it was evolved to do: stabilize experience so you can keep functioning in a predictable environment. Psychologists noticed this decades ago. The renowned researchers Brickman and Campbell showed that satisfaction tends to return to a baseline even after major positive changes. Important studies by Frederick and Lowenstein later demonstrated that adaptation dulls emotional contrast over time. The system smooths out the peaks and troughs, so you're not constantly overwhelmed by change. That mechanism works beautifully in the early and the mid stages of growth, but it becomes incomplete later. Adaptation, therefore, is not a flaw. It's a feature that stops scaling when responsibility increases faster than your internal development. And that brings us to the second layer, the one that far fewer people are ever prepared for. As the stakes increase, earlier psychological strategies end up staying in place. The beliefs that once drove success remain unquestioned. The habits that protected you under pressure keep running automatically. Old fears, old ambitions, old identity continue to shape your decisions behind the scenes. These don't disappear with success. They, in fact, go underground. The part of you that learned to stay ahead by controlling outcomes doesn't just retire. The part that equated worth with performance doesn't just politely step aside. The strategies that once helped you survive uncertainty keep firing, even when the environment has changed. And because they worked before, they feel correct. And what was never examined ends up becoming invisible. And what remains invisible cannot be updated. And what can't be updated quietly sets an upper limit. This is where cognitive biases intensify. Like the confirmation bias begins to protect familiar strategies even when the conditions no longer justify them. Threat sensitivity increases, so risks are assessed through a lens of loss prevention rather than long-term value. Control bias creeps in, replacing discernment with tighter oversight. Confidence remains outwardly intact, but it starts masking unresolved resistance underneath. Judgment hasn't collapsed, it's stopped evolving. From the inside, this feels like prudence, maybe like maturity, like being careful. From the outside, it still looks competent. The results still arrive and authority still remains intact. But internally, the system is working harder to produce the same outcomes. Decisions require more justification. Flexibility decreases. Novel options feel less attractive, not because they're actually worse, but because they threaten some internal agreements that were never renegotiated. This is where people start talking about an invisible upper limit, usually in vague or mystical terms, but the reality is much more concrete. At a certain level, progress stops being blocked by skill or effort, and it's blocked by internal constraints instead that were formed earlier and never revised. The mind reaches the edge of its previous development, and beyond that edge, pressure activates resistance. Growth begins to trigger behaviors that slow or sabotage your progress, even though they feel rational from the inside. You hesitate where you once moved. You overanalyze decisions that you would have made cleanly before. You double down on methods that used to work while quietly dismissing alternatives that require a different internal posture. This doesn't feel like self-sabotage. It feels like good judgment. And that's actually the danger. The ceiling isn't imposed by the world. It's enforced by internal rules that once worked and were never revised. Sometimes success comes with a hidden cost. You might have built a career, a business, or a life you thought you wanted, but inside, maybe you feel burned out or unfulfilled. Or maybe it shows up in your relationships with your partner, your family, or your team, where no matter how hard you try, the same painful patterns keep repeating. If this resonates, I've got something you might be interested in. It's a free 2-minute assessment that helps you uncover the number one block that's been holding you back in love, in leadership, or in life. And once you take it, you'll get a masterclass tailored specifically to your results, so you'll know exactly where to focus to move forward. It's quick, it's practical, and it can change the way you see yourself and your path ahead. Take the first step right now at dtphd.com/quiz. That's dtphd.com/quiz. And this is the crucial reframe here. The problem isn't stress, it isn't ambition, and it isn't a lack of discipline. The problem is distorted signal produced by an outdated internal operating system. When the internal system can no longer update its assumptions under pressure, then effort becomes inefficient. Optimization produces diminishing returns. Control creates friction rather than clarity. This is why the usual solutions fail at this next stage. More effort tightens the loop. More optimization amplifies the bias. More control reduces signal quality even further. The challenge is no longer about doing more, it's about restoring accuracy. And that requires a different kind of work, one that most achievers were never trained to do, because until now, they didn't need it. Once scale enters the picture, everything we've been talking about gets louder. This is where the research by Nobel Prize winner Kahneman and Killingsworth becomes especially relevant. Their work showed something that cuts directly against the cultural myth. Money amplifies baseline well-being. It does not correct it. If your internal state is stable and clear, then more resources tend to help. But if it's already distorted, more resources don't fix the distortion. In fact, they magnify it. This matters because scale doesn't arrive neutrally. It arrives with leverage, with speed, with consequence. So when internal clarity is high, scale can be a force multiplier. Decisions compound well, delegation works, complexity becomes manageable because judgment remains accurate under pressure. When internal clarity is degraded, though, scale does something else entirely. It turns small biases into structural problems. With more leverage comes fewer checks. Decisions that once passed through friction now pass through mere authority. Fewer people challenge your assumptions. Fewer constraints slow momentum. The system trusts your judgment because the system was built around it. Speed increases as well. Decisions are made faster, often out of necessity. There's less time for reflection, not because reflection isn't valued, but because the cost of delay feels higher than the cost of error. But that calculation only works when judgment is clear. As the stakes rise, threat sensitivity intensifies. The nervous system becomes more alert to downside. Risk assessment starts leaning defensive. Options that protect existing gains feel safer than those that require internal recalibration. This doesn't look like fear. It looks like prudence. It looks like experience talking. But the signal is already compromised. What scale does, quietly and consistently, is remove the buffering that once corrected your errors. Early on, mistakes were contained. Later, they propagate. Early on, misjudgments taught lessons. Later, they create policies, cultures, and long-term commitments. That's why this stage feels so confusing to people who reach it. From the outside, it looks like the success is continuing. But from the inside, decisions feel heavier. The margin for error feels thinner. Control tightens. Familiar strategies are favored even when the environment is changing. The system still rewards you, which makes it harder to question the accuracy of your own judgment. And this is the part no one else will prepare you for. Scale doesn't expose your best thinking. It actually exposes your baseline. If the baseline is clear, scale looks like freedom. If the baseline is noisy, scale feels like pressure without relief. And here's the line that most people miss, because it sounds counterintuitive until you've lived it. Scale doesn't fix signal problems. It just makes them louder. It amplifies whatever is already running beneath the surface. The assumptions you've stopped examining, the strategies that once worked and now quietly constrain you, the internal rules that were never designed for this level of responsibility. And at that point, adding more resources does not create clarity. It creates volume. And volume is only useful when the signal is clean. Now, this is where the cost actually scales to, not in the form of collapse or public failure, but in the quiet corrosion of your judgment. Distortion rarely announces itself. It shows up instead in patterns that look sensible on the surface. Familiar strategies get refined again and again, long past the point of diminishing returns. What once worked gets optimized instead of questioned. The system becomes excellent at executing known plays, even when the game has changed. Control increases as well. More oversight, more approval layers, more insistence on alignment. This doesn't feel like insecurity. It feels like responsibility. It feels like protecting what has already been built. But control begins to substitute for insight. Instead of seeing more clearly, you try to manage outcomes more tightly. Intensity rises too. More effort, longer hours, faster decisions. There's a sense of urgency that feels purposeful, even virtuous. But intensity is not the same thing as clarity. Pushing harder can drown out weak signal just as easily as it can strengthen it. And here's the blind spot that makes this stage so difficult to recognize. The very skills that built your success now protect the distortion. Your ability to focus becomes tunnel vision. Your confidence in judgment reduces your willingness to question it. Your tolerance for pressure makes it easier to ignore internal friction. You've learned how to win in complex environments, and now that competence becomes a shield against noticing when your internal map no longer matches the terrain. From the outside, this still looks like leadership, decisiveness, experience. But from the inside, it feels heavier than it used to, but not wrong enough yet to stop. This is why generic business advice fails at this level. Most advice assumes that effort is the bottleneck, that clarity improves if you work harder or think longer or collect more information. That assumption holds earlier on. It stops holding once the distortion is internal. More strategy doesn't help when the lens itself is warped. More data doesn't correct bias when the interpretation is already constrained. More frameworks only add complexity to a system that has lost accuracy. This is why performance can continue even as your clarity is declining, because the machine still runs, processes still function, the momentum carries decisions forward. Past wins keep generating future results for a while. The feedback loop is delayed now enough that errors don't immediately register as errors. So success becomes self-reinforcing in the wrong way. The system keeps rewarding output, not accuracy. It confirms authority, not truth. And because nothing's broken yet, there's little incentive to slow down and question the signal. At this higher level, effort is now no longer the constraint. Truth-tracking accuracy is. The tragedy here isn't collapse. It's continuation without correction. Because as long as performance remains acceptable, the deeper problem stays hidden. And judgment, once corrupted, rarely repairs itself through effort alone. So let's name this as clearly as possible. The curve didn't flatten because you failed. It flattened because your internal instrumentation lost accuracy. That distinction matters because it changes where you look for the solution. Most people respond to this phase by questioning their motivation. They wonder if they've become complacent or lazy or distracted or softer than they used to be. They assume the answer lies in discipline, ambition, or resilience. And that assumption is totally understandable, but it's also wrong at this higher level. Earlier in the journey, effort really was the lever. More focus really did produce better results. More ambition opened doors. More resilience carried you through uncertainty. And those tools worked because your internal readings were reliable back then. You could feel when something was right or wrong. You could sense when a decision aligned with reality. You got immediate feedback from the market or reality. What's different now is not your character, it's your instrumentation. Every complex system depends on accurate measurement. When instruments drift, performance degrades even if the engine is still strong. The pilot can be skilled, the aircraft can be powerful, but if the instruments are off, the trajectory suffers quietly until the margin disappears. The same thing happens here. Your motivation may still be intact. Your ambition may still be sharp. Your capacity to endure pressure may even be stronger than before. None of that fixes distorted signal. In fact, those strengths can accelerate the problem by pushing harder on faulty readings. This is why the experience feels so confusing. You're doing what's always worked for you. You're applying proven strengths. But decisions feel heavier. Outcomes feel less clear. Control increases while confidence thins. The bottleneck has moved. If the clarity of your judgment isn't scaling with your responsibility now, the issue isn't effort, it's signal integrity. That's the core teaching of this episode. Once responsibility outpaces internal accuracy, pushing harder stops helping. Optimizing execution produces diminishing returns. Adding more goals increases noise. Doubling down on intensity masks the problem rather than solving it. What's required now, instead, is recalibration. That concept is really important because it points to precision rather than force. It implies examining assumptions that were never revisited. It means questioning internal rules that once worked under different conditions. It requires distinguishing between confidence that comes from repetition and clarity that comes from truth. This isn't about slowing down for comfort. It's about restoring accuracy under pressure. Until the instrumentation is corrected, motivation will be misdirected. Ambition will amplify bias. Resilience will keep you functioning inside a distorted system. And that's why so many high performers stay busy while quietly losing clarity. They keep feeding the engine when what's needed is to check the instruments. Most achievers sense this long before they can admit it. They feel the drag in decision-making. They notice the extra effort that it takes to reach the same outcomes. They recognize the impulse to tighten control, to optimize harder, to remove uncertainty wherever possible. But they rarely name what's actually happening, because admitting it would mean questioning what they've relied on for years, their own judgment. So the question hangs there, unresolved for now. If effort isn't the answer, then what is? If motivation isn't the missing piece, then how is clarity restored? What actually recalibrates judgment once the internal signals have drifted? That's what I'll be getting to in the next episode. I just want to emphasize at this point that the instincts that most achievers reach for tend to make the problem worse. More control reduces sensitivity to signal. More optimization locks in outdated assumptions. More certainty narrows perception at the exact moment that it needs to widen. And that's like a paradox. The tools that once created success become liabilities when the internal accuracy is degraded. And the solution, whatever it is, doesn't feel intuitive to people who have been rewarded for decisiveness, intensity, control. And that's what we'll unpack next. In the following episode, we'll look at why the very moves that feel responsible and prudent at this stage quietly deepen the distortion, and why restoring clarity requires a different posture entirely. For now, just sit with this. The danger isn't in losing performance. The danger is trusting corrupted judgment.